The wagon wheels groaned against the dried earth as Matthew Langford's hired carriage lurched to a stop. Through the dust-caked window, he glimpsed his destination, a weathered homestead slouching against the Colorado horizon like a wounded animal. The driver, a grizzled man who'd barely spoken during the 3-hour journey from town, spat tobacco juice and muttered, "That's the Ward place, mister," though most folks round here call it something else. "What do they call it?" Matthew asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know. "The widow's curse," the driver said, refusing to meet his eyes. "I'll wait here while you conduct your business. Won't be but a minute, I reckon." Matthew stepped down from the carriage, his city boots finding uncertain purchase on the hard-packed soil. The March wind cut through his wool coat like a blade, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else. Abandonment. Perhaps. The house stood 50 yards away, its unpainted boards silvered by weather and time. Half the roof had caved in, and the windows stared back at him like empty eye sockets. He'd bought this place sight unseen from a land company in Denver, seeking distance from the life he'd built and destroyed in equal measure. The railroad fortune meant nothing now, not after Margaret's death, not after little Sarah had followed her mother into the ground. Out here, he thought, perhaps the emptiness inside him might find its match in the landscape. The front door hung askew on rusted hinges. Matthew pushed it open, wincing at the shriek of metal on metal. Inside, shadows pooled in corners despite the afternoon light filtering through gaps in the walls. He'd expected emptiness, decay, perhaps the skittering of rodents. He hadn't expected the woman. She sat in a ladder-backed chair near the cold fireplace, a rifle across her lap. Her dark hair hung in a loose braid over one shoulder, and her dress, once blue, now faded to the color of winter sky, bore the careful patches of someone who knew poverty intimately. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold, gray as storm clouds, holding neither fear nor welcome. "You're trespassing," she said. Her voice carried the worn edges of someone who hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks, maybe months. Matthew reached slowly into his coat pocket, producing the deed. "I believe you're mistaken. Ma'am, I purchased this property from the Colorado Land Development Company. The transaction was completed last month." She didn't lower the rifle. "They had no right to sell it. The deed says otherwise. This homestead was listed as abandoned, all taxes in arrears. My husband's dead. That doesn't make it abandoned." She shifted slightly, and Matthew noticed how thin she was, how her knuckles stood out white where she gripped the weapon. "This is all I have left." The driver had been right. This wouldn't be a minute's business. Matthew studied her. This unexpected complication. In Denver, he would have simply called for the sheriff, had her removed. But something in her bearing, perhaps the way she held that rifle like she knew precisely how to use it, made him reconsider. "I'm not here to throw you out," he said carefully. "I didn't know anyone still lived here. We can reach an arrangement. I'll pay you fairly for your trouble, help you relocate." Her laugh was bitter as alkali water. "Relocate? You think any town within 100 miles would take in Eliza Ward? You think I haven't tried?" The name meant nothing to him, but the way she said it, like it was a curse itself, made him pause. He noticed other things now, the neat stack of firewood by the hearth, the patched but clean curtains, a row of preserved vegetables on a shelf. She'd been surviving here, alone, through winter. "How long since your husband passed?" 14 months. Her eyes never left his face. 14 months of folks waiting for me to die or leave so they could pick this place clean. Well, I'm still here. Matthew removed his hat, ran a hand through hair that had gone silver too early. At 41, he felt ancient, hollowed out by grief. This woman couldn't be more than 25, yet she wore her solitude like armor. "The deed is legal," he said finally. "But I'm not an unreasonable man. You can stay until you find other arrangements. I'll need time anyway to assess what repairs are necessary." "Stay?" She lowered the rifle slightly. "You mean to live here?" "That was my intention. Yes." She studied him then, taking in his city clothes, his soft hands, the quality of his boots. You ever worked a homestead, Mr. Langford, Matthew Langford? And no, but I'm prepared to learn. This time her laugh held a note of genuine amusement. This land doesn't forgive ignorance. Mr. Langford, it's killed better men than you. Then perhaps you could educate me, in exchange for room and board, temporarily. She stood slowly, the rifle now pointing at the floor but still in her hands. You're proposing we share this house? It's large enough. You could take the back rooms. I'll manage with the front, just until spring breaks properly, until you can make other plans. Folks will talk. Let them. She moved closer, and he caught her scent, smoke and lye soap and something wild, like sage crushed underfoot. You don't know what you're offering. Mr. Langford, this place is cursed. Everything it touches withers. I don't believe in curses. Mrs. Ward, give it time. She set the rifle against the wall, a gesture that might have been surrender or simply exhaustion. The back rooms are mine. You'll find the well out back, but test the water first. It runs cloudy after storms. The barn's about to collapse, so don't store anything valuable there. And Mr. Langford? Yes? When the wind comes down from the mountains at night, it sounds like screaming, just so you know. She retreated to the back of the house, leaving Matthew alone with the shadows and the growing certainty that he'd complicated his simple plan for solitude. Outside, he heard the carriage driver calling, asking if he was ready to return to town. I'll be staying, Matthew called back. Can you bring my trunks from the station? The driver's curses carried on the wind as Matthew surveyed his new domain. The house groaned around him, settling into evening. Through a gap in the wall, he could see the mountains darkening against the sky, and yes, he could already hear it, that high, lonesome sound of wind through stone, like screaming. She'd said, he thought of Margaret, of Sarah, of all the screaming he'd done inside his own head these past 2 years. Perhaps this place and its haunted widow were exactly what he deserved. As darkness gathered, he heard movement from the back rooms, the scrape of a chair, the hollow thud of wood being added to a fire. Eliza Ward was going about her evening as if he weren't there, as if she were still alone. He'd bought this homestead to escape the ghosts of his past, only to find it already occupied by the living. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of making this place habitable again. Tonight, he would sleep in a broken house with a woman who carried her own grief like a weapon, while the wind screamed down from the mountains and the temperature dropped toward freezing. He'd wanted solitude. Instead, he'd found something far more dangerous, a kindred spirit in suffering, someone else who'd been carved hollow by loss. As he unpacked his few belongings by lamplight, Matthew wondered which of them would break first under the weight of such terrible proximity. The first week tested every assumption Matthew had brought with him from Denver. His attempts to repair the collapsed section of roof ended with him nearly falling through the rafters. The well pump handle broke off in his hands when he tried to draw water. Even starting a fire in the pot-bellied stove became an exercise in humiliation, the green wood he'd gathered refusing to catch while smoke filled the room. Eliza watched these failures from a distance, moving through the house like a ghost. She rose before dawn, tended her own fire, prepared her own simple meals, and disappeared into the back rooms each evening without a word. Matthew might have been furniture for all the attention she paid him. On the 8th morning, he woke to find frost coating the inside of the windows and his water bucket frozen solid, his fingers already blistered from unsuccessful carpentry attempts, cramped with cold as he tried to light the stove. The matches kept breaking, his hands shaking too badly to strike them properly. You'll freeze to death before you get that lit. Eliza stood in the doorway, wrapped in a moth-eaten shawl. Without waiting for permission, she knelt beside the stove and began arranging kindling with practiced efficiency. Paper first, then dried grass, then twigs no thicker than your little finger. The wood you've been using is too green. It needs to season for months before it'll burn proper. She had the fire crackling within minutes. Matthew watched her work, noting the confident economy of her movements, the way she positioned the wood to create airways. When she stood, he saw her hands were as calloused as any ranch hands. "Thank you," he said, extending his hands toward the growing warmth. She shrugged. "Can't have you freezing to death. People would blame me for that, too." "Too?" But she was already moving toward the door. "There's a wood pile behind the barn. That's seasoned wood. The green stuff you've been gathering is only good for smoking meat." That afternoon, she found him struggling with the well pump, trying to reattach the handle with wire. "You need a new pin," she said. "There's spare parts in the barn, if you know where to look." "Perhaps you could show me?" She hesitated, then nodded. The barn was even worse than the house. Half the structure had collapsed, and what remained groaned ominously in the wind. But Eliza navigated the debris with sure steps, leading him to a corner where tools and supplies hung from hooks. "Sam was always meaning to fix things properly," she said, running her hand along a row of rusty implements. "Always tomorrow, always next season." Her voice carried no bitterness, only a tired sort of resignation. She found the pump pin and handed it to him. In the dim light filtering through gaps in the barn walls, he could see her face more clearly than he had since his arrival. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her cheekbones stood out too sharply. When had she last eaten a proper meal? That evening, Matthew prepared enough stew for two. He knocked on the door, separating their living spaces. "Mrs. Ward, I've made supper, more than I can eat alone." Silence. "It seems foolish for us both to cook separately when we could share resources." More silence. Then footsteps. She opened the door part way. "I manage fine on my own." "I'm sure you do, but I'm offering as much for my benefit as yours." "I could use the company." She studied him for a long moment. "Company," she repeated, as if tasting a foreign word. Finally, she stepped into the main room. They ate in silence at first, sitting across from each other at the rough-hewn table. The stew was simple: salt pork, potatoes, wild onions he'd found growing near the well. But Eliza ate with careful concentration, as if reminding her body what it meant to be truly fed. "You were right about the wind," Matthew said eventually. "It does sound like screaming." "You get used to it." She paused. "Or you go mad. One or the other." "Which are you?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Jury's still out." As the days passed, they developed a rhythm of cautious cooperation. Eliza showed him how to bank the fire at night so coals remained for morning, how to read weather signs in the cloud formations over the mountains, where to find the springs that ran clear even when the well water turned murky. In exchange, Matthew shared his supplies: coffee, flour, salt, and other goods from town. He noticed how her eyes widened at the sight of real coffee beans, how she held the cup with both hands as if it were precious beyond measure. One afternoon, he returned from a failed attempt at patching the barn to find her skinning a rabbit. "Where did that come from?" She gestured toward an ancient rifle propped against the house. "Same place they always come from. You hunt." "When I have ammunition." She made quick, precise cuts, separating fur from flesh with practiced ease, which isn't often these days. Matthew thought of his own rifle, still packed in its case, ammunition plentiful. "I have cartridges, if you need them." Her hand stilled. "Why? Why what? Why help me? You could have the sheriff remove me any time. Why share your supplies, your food?" He considered the question. The truth was complicated, something about her loneliness echoing his own, about the way she moved through grief with a practical grace he envied. But he said only, "Because it's winter, because we're both here. Isn't that enough?" She resumed her work. "Nothing's ever that simple. Mr. Langford." A blizzard struck 2 weeks into their arrangement. The wind howled down from the peaks with a fury that made the usual screaming seem like whispers. Snow piled against the walls, seeping through every gap and crack. The temperature plummeted until even standing near the stove provided little comfort. Matthew had banked the fire as Eliza taught him, but by midnight, the cold was unbearable. He could hear his teeth chattering, could feel his feet going numb despite 2 pairs of wool socks. From the back rooms, he heard nothing. Eliza might have been frozen solid for all he knew. He knocked on her door. No answer. Knocked again. Harder. "Mrs. Ward? Eliza?" A muffled response he couldn't make out. Growing concerned, he pushed the door open. She lay curled on a narrow cot, buried under what looked like every blanket she owned, still shivering. The small fireplace in her room was cold. She'd run out of wood. "Without thinking," Matthew said. "This is foolish. Come to the main room. We'll share the heat." "I'm fine. You're freezing. Come on." He gathered her blankets, pretending not to notice how thin they were, how carefully mended. She followed reluctantly, wrapped in her shawl. He arranged their bedding near the stove, his thick wool blankets on the floor, her thinner ones on top. "Body heat," he said, avoiding her eyes. "It's how surveyors survive in the mountains." They lay down with careful distance between them. But as the night wore on and the cold pressed in like a living thing, that distance narrowed. Matthew woke once to find her pressed against his back, her arm thrown across him in sleep. He held very still, afraid to wake her, afraid to acknowledge how long it had been since another human had touched him with anything approaching tenderness. When dawn came, pale and bitter cold, they pulled apart without speaking. But something had shifted. The careful walls they'd built began to show cracks. That evening, as they shared a meal of rabbit stew, Eliza spoke unprompted for the first time. "Sam used to say this land was cursed, said it turned everything mean and hard, like itself." She stared into her cup. Maybe he was right. Maybe it turned him mean, too. Matthew waited, sensing more words gathering behind her careful composure. "He wasn't always cruel," she continued. "When we first married, he was different, full of dreams about what we'd build here. But the land broke every promise. Crops failed, cattle died, wells ran dry, and each failure made him smaller, meaner, until... She looked up at him then, her gray eyes holding depths he hadn't expected. Until there was nothing left but the meanness. The weight of what she wasn't saying hung between them. Matthew thought of his own marriage, how grief had poisoned it long before Margaret's death, how success in business had meant failure in everything that mattered. "I came here to escape," he said quietly. "My wife, my daughter, they died. Scarlet fever. I thought if I could find somewhere empty enough, maybe the guilt would have room to dissipate. Has it? No, it just echoes more." She reached across the table, her fingertips barely brushing his hand before pulling back. It was the first time she'd touched him while awake, and the shock of it ran through him like lightning. Outside, the wind had picked up again, bringing fresh snow. But inside, for the first time since he'd arrived, the house felt less like a tomb and more like shelter. Two damaged souls taking refuge from the storm. It wasn't much, but it was no longer nothing. Spring came reluctantly to the high country, fighting winter for every inch of ground. The snow retreated to reveal mud, dead grass, and the full extent of the homestead's deterioration. But with the warming days came a tentative partnership between Matthew and Eliza that surprised them both. They worked side by side now, rebuilding the fence line that had collapsed under snow weight. Matthew had learned to read her silences, when she was merely focused on work versus when shadows from the past crept too close. She, in turn, had stopped flinching when he appeared unexpectedly, no longer keeping one hand near her rifle at all times. "Hold it steady," she instructed as they set a new fence post. Mud squelched around their boots, and the morning sun felt like a blessing after months of cold. "The ground's still soft. It'll shift if we don't pack it right." Matthew gripped the post while she shoveled dirt around its base, tamping it down with practiced strikes. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air, and she'd rolled her sleeves up, revealing arms marked with old scars he tried not to notice. "You're getting better at this," she said, stepping back to assess their work. "I had a good teacher." She almost smiled. He'd learned to recognize these near misses of happiness, fleeting as hawk shadows. "Don't get cocky. You still can't milk a cow without getting kicked. That cow has a personal vendetta against me. She just knows a city man when she smells one." They were laughing, actually laughing, when the riders appeared on the horizon. 3 men, moving with the purposeful pace of those who knew exactly where they were going. Eliza's laughter died instantly. She reached for the rifle she'd leaned against the fence. "Get inside," she said quietly. "Eliza." "Get inside, Matthew, please." But he stayed beside her as the riders approached. The lead man was heavy-set, wearing a beaver hat despite the warming weather. His companions looked like hired muscle, the kind Matthew had occasionally employed in his railroad days to encourage reluctant sellers. "Mrs. Ward," the leader said, touching his hat brim in a mockery of politeness. "Still here, I see." "Mr. Thornton." Eliza's voice could have frozen the spring runoff. "Still trespassing, I see." Thornton's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Now, that's a matter of perspective. The Colorado Land Development Company has interests in this territory. We've been patient, considering your circumstances, but patience has limits." "This land isn't for sale," Matthew said, stepping forward. "I hold the deed." Thornton's eyes shifted to him, taking in his improved but still obviously Eastern clothing. "You must be Langford. Heard you'd taken up residence. Also heard you were a smart businessman back in Denver. Smart men know when to cut their losses. Smart men also know illegal intimidation when they see it." "Illegal?" Thornton chuckled. "Nothing illegal about concerned citizens checking on a widow's welfare, especially one with such an unfortunate reputation." Eliza's knuckles went white on the rifle stock. Matthew placed a hand on her arm, feeling the tension thrumming through her like a plucked wire. "The lady's welfare is my concern now," Matthew said evenly. "As is this property. I suggest you deliver any future communications through proper legal channels." "Legal channels." Thornton spat tobacco juice dangerously close to Matthew's boots. "Out here, mister. Langford, legal is what men with guns say it is. You might want to remember that." One of his companions, a lean man with dead eyes, let his coat fall open to reveal a well-worn pistol. "Accidents happen on homesteads, barn fires, well, water going bad, cowboys getting drunk and trigger-happy." "Is that a threat?" "Just observing the dangers of frontier life." Thornton said, "For instance, it'd be a shame if something happened and Mrs. Ward was left all alone again. We all know how that ended last time." The rifle was in motion before Matthew could stop her. Eliza brought the barrel up, aiming steady at Thornton's chest. "Get off my land." "Your land?" Thornton's laugh was ugly. "Woman can't own land without a husband. Everyone knows that." "Then I'll rent it from Mr. Langford for the price of a bullet. Would you like to collect?" For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Then Thornton smiled, reining his horse around. "We'll be back, Mrs. Ward, with papers." "With the sheriff, with whatever it takes. This land's too valuable to waste on a crazy woman and a fool Easterner." They rode off slowly, making a show of their lack of fear. Matthew waited until they were out of sight before gently lowering Eliza's rifle. "They'll be back," she said, her voice hollow. "Let them come. I've dealt with their kind before. Not like this." She turned to face him fully, and he saw fear beneath her anger. "You don't understand. Thornton owns the sheriff. He owns the judge. He's just been waiting for an excuse to—" She cut herself off, but Matthew could fill in the blanks. A young widow, alone, defenseless, or so they'd thought. "Pack what you need," he said suddenly. "We're going to town." "What?" "If they want to play legal games, we'll play. But first, I need you to tell me everything. About Sam, about his death, about why they really want this land." She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, while she gathered her few belongings. Matthew retrieved his strongbox from its hiding place. Inside lay more than enough gold certificates to wage a proper war. The ride to Redemption Creek took 4 hours through country that was beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. Eliza rode Sam's old mare with a natural grace that made Matthew's adequate horsemanship look clumsy. She'd changed into her best dress, still patched, but clean and pressed with care. He'd offered to buy her new clothes, But she'd refused with a pride he was learning not to challenge. They didn't speak much on the trail, but when they stopped to water the horses, she finally told him, "There's silver on this land," she said quietly. "Sam found traces in the creek that runs through the back 40. He was drunk when he told Jake Morrison at the saloon. By morning, he was dead." "How?" "Shot in the back on his way home. They said it was a drifter. Robbery gone wrong. But nothing was taken except his assay samples." "And Morrison?" "Works for Thornton now. Funny how that happened." She kicked at a stone. "The whole town decided I must have hired someone to kill Sam. Easier than admitting one of their own was a murderer." Matthew felt the old familiar burn, the same rage that had driven him to crush competitors in the railroad business. But now it had a different focus, a protective edge that surprised him. "We'll hire a lawyer from Denver if we have to, file claims on the mineral rights, make it more expensive to fight us than to leave us alone." "Us?" She looked at him sideways. "Unless you prefer to fight alone." She was quiet for a moment. Then, so softly, he almost missed it. "No, not anymore." Redemption Creek squatted in a valley like a boil on the landscape. One main street, unpaved and rutted, ran between false-fronted buildings that looked ready to blow away in a strong wind. The largest structure was the Thornton Land and Cattle Company office, its painted sign gleaming with aggressive prosperity. Their arrival caused a stir. Matthew had expected stares, but the naked hostility directed at Eliza shocked him. Women pulled their children inside. Men spat as she passed. Someone muttered, "Witch," just loud enough to be heard. Eliza kept her head high, but he saw the cost in the rigid set of her shoulders. The lawyer's office was above the general store. Josiah Mills, attorney at law. The shingle read. Mills was a thin man with the look of someone slowly drinking himself to death. His hands shook as he poured whiskey that Matthew declined and Eliza ignored. "I can't help you," Mills said before they'd even explained their case. "Nobody can, not against Thornton. Everyone has a price," Matthew said. "Name yours." Mills laughed bitterly. "My price, my life, Mr. Langford. That's what it would cost to go against Thornton in this town. Find yourself a Denver lawyer if you must, but they won't live long enough to file papers." They left the office in silence. But on the stairs, a young woman caught Eliza's sleeve. "Mrs. Ward?" Matthew recognized her from Eliza's description. Myra, who'd worked in the Ward household. "I can't talk to you," Myra whispered, glancing around nervously. "But meet me behind the church tonight, after dark. There's something you need to know." Before they could respond, she hurried away. They spent the rest of the day in town, Matthew making strategic purchases while Eliza endured the town's collective shunning with stubborn grace. He bought ammunition, tools, several months' worth of supplies. Let Thornton see he meant to stay. That evening, as shadows lengthened between buildings, they made their way to the small church at the town's edge. Myra waited in the graveyard, a shawl pulled tight around her thin shoulders. "I saw who killed your husband," she said without preamble. "It was Jake Morrison, just like you suspected, but that's not what I needed to tell you." Eliza gripped Matthew's arm. "What then?" "Thornton's planning something. My new employer, Mrs. Thornton. She talks when she's had her laudanum. There's a government surveyor coming next month. If you're not off that land by then, they're going to make sure you're not there to dispute their claim." "Make sure how?" Myra's eyes darted between them. "The same way they made sure about Sam. Only this time, they'll burn the place to be certain." She pressed a folded paper into Eliza's hand. "I wrote down what I heard, dates and names. It's not much, but maybe." "Why help us?" Matthew asked. "Because Mrs. Ward was kind to me when no one else was. Because what they did was wrong." She pulled her shawl tighter. "I have to go. Don't follow me. And don't come back to town unless you have an army." She disappeared into the darkness. Eliza unfolded the paper, reading by the faint light from the church windows. Her face went very still. "What is it?" She handed him the paper. In careful script, Myra had written names, dates, and fragments of overheard conversation. But one line stood out. Burn them out April 15th. Make it look like Indians. 2 weeks away. We should leave, Eliza said quietly. You could go back to Denver, start over somewhere Thornton can't reach. Is that what you want? She looked up at him, and in the dim light, he saw tears she'd never let fall in daylight. What I want hasn't mattered in a very long time. He pulled her against him, felt her stiffen, then slowly relax. She smelled of soap and saddle leather, and underneath, that wild sage scent that was purely hers. Then maybe it's time it did, he said into her hair. They rode home through darkness, alert for ambush that never came. But as they crested the final rise before the homestead, Eliza suddenly reined in. Matthew, she breathed. There, nailed to their newly repaired fence post, was a dead coyote. Its blood had dried in dark streaks down the wood, and a note was pinned to its chest. Last warning. Eliza made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Welcome to my curse, Mr. Langford. But Matthew was already pulling the carcass down. His jaw set in lines she recognized from their fence work, pure, stubborn determination. Then we'd better prepare for a siege, he said, as they unsaddled the horses. Eliza caught his hand. You could still leave. This isn't your fight. He thought of his empty house in Denver, of all the ways money had failed to save what mattered. Then he looked at this woman who'd survived alone through winter and worse, who faced the world's cruelty with a rifle and raw courage. Maybe not, he said, but I'm making it mine. That night, they didn't retreat to separate rooms. They sat by the fire, planning defenses, cleaning weapons, and not talking about the fact that she'd let her hand rest on his knee, or that he'd covered it with his own. War was coming to their small homestead, but for the first time in years, neither of them would face it alone. The days following their return from town took on a strange quality. Ordinary domestic tasks shadowed by impending violence. They reinforced the shutters, stocked water barrels, turned the root cellar into a potential refuge. But in the evenings, when the work was done, something else entirely occupied the space between them. It started with stories. Matthew spoke of his childhood in Philadelphia, his father's shipping business, the relentless drive that had carried him west to build his railroad fortune. Eliza shared memories of growing up on a small farm in Missouri, before drought and debt drove her family to seek new chances in Colorado territory. I was 17 when we arrived, she said one evening, mending a harness while Matthew cleaned his rifle. Papa saw all this open land and thought we'd found Eden. Mama saw the graves along the trail and knew better. What happened to them? Fever took Mama the second winter. Papa just faded after that, like he'd been holding on just for her. She made another careful stitch. Sam showed up at the funeral, said he'd help me keep the farm running. I was grateful then. How long before you married? 3 months. Seemed like the practical thing. I needed protection. He needed a wife. Neither of us called it love. She looked up at him. Did you love Margaret when you married her? The question caught him off guard. I thought I did. Or maybe I loved the idea of her. Beautiful, refined, everything a successful man should want. But I was gone more than I was home, building my empire. She used to say I loved my ledgers more than I loved her. He paused. She wasn't wrong. Yet you blame yourself for her death. If I'd been there more, noticed sooner she was sick. You can't parse out blame like entries in those ledgers. Matthew, trust me, I've tried. That night, she told him the full truth about Sam. Not all at once, but in pieces between long silences. The drinking that started early and ended late, the fists that followed when the bottle ran dry, the cruelty that wore a dozen masks, neglect, contempt, and finally, violence. I thought about leaving, she said, staring into the fire. But where would I go? A woman alone with no money, no family? At least here I could hide, make myself small, survive. Until he died. She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, the night Sam died, he'd been drinking with Morrison at the saloon. Came home talking about the silver, about how we'd be rich. But he was also talking about selling me along with the land. Said Morrison had offered a good price for both. Matthew's hands clenched. Eliza? I didn't kill him, if that's what you're wondering, though God knows I thought about it enough times. When he left to go back to town, I prayed he wouldn't return. Sometimes I think that prayer is what killed him, like I cursed him with my wanting. That's not how curses work. Isn't it? She turned to look at him fully. You came here to escape ghosts. I carry mine. Maybe that's why the land let you stay. It recognized another haunted soul. He moved without thinking, crossing the space between their chairs to kneel beside her. You're not cursed. You're the strongest person I've known. She touched his face, her calloused fingers gentle against his cheek. Strength and curses aren't opposites. Sometimes one creates the other. The kiss happened slowly, inevitably, like snow beginning to fall. Her lips were chapped from wind, tasted of the coffee they'd shared. When they parted, she kept her hand on his face. This is dangerous, she whispered. Everything here is dangerous. Not like this. But she kissed him again anyway. They pulled apart at the sound of horses approaching, too many to be friendly. Matthew grabbed his rifle while Eliza blew out the lamp. In the darkness, they took positions by the windows. Maybe a dozen riders? Eliza whispered. They're spreading out. A voice called from outside, not Thornton, but one of his men. Langford, Mrs. Ward. Mister, Thornton wants to make you a final offer. Come out and hear him out. Stay inside, Matthew told Eliza, but she was already moving toward the door. Together or not at all, she said. They stepped onto the porch. Thornton sat his horse in the middle of a semicircle of armed men, torches casting dancing shadows. The threat was unsubtle. $5,000, Thornton said without preamble. Cash. You leave tonight, sign the deed over, and never come back. The land's worth 10 times that if there's silver, Matthew said. It's worth nothing if you're dead. Thornton's smile was a wound in his face. This is generosity. Langford, more than a witch and a fool deserve. The answer's no. I expected as much. Thornton nodded to his men. Several dismounted, moving toward the barn with their torches. Shame about fires, so hard to control once they start. Eliza raised her rifle. Touch that barn and I'll put a hole in you. You'll hang for murder, only if they find your body. The standoff stretched taut. Then Matthew spoke, his voice carrying the authority of boardrooms and business wars. Before you light those torches, Thornton, you should know I telegraphed my lawyers in Denver yesterday. Full documentation of your threats, copies of the mineral assays Sam Ward filed, and instructions to investigate thoroughly if anything happens to us. It was a lie. They hadn't been back to town, but delivered with such conviction that Thornton's men hesitated. You're bluffing. Try me. I've destroyed bigger men than you over smaller stakes. This land is legally mine, and I have the resources to prove it. Burn us out, and you'll have federal marshals crawling over this county within a month. Thornton studied him for a long moment. Then he laughed. You've got spine. Easterner. But spine won't stop a bullet in the dark. And that witch beside you, the town's ready to stone her themselves. All I have to do is step aside. Then you'll have to go through me first, if necessary. Thornton wheeled his horse around. You've got 1 week to reconsider. After that, well, the frontier's a dangerous place. They watched the riders disappear into darkness. Only when the hoofbeats faded did Eliza lower her rifle. He'll be back, she said. I know. Inside, she lit the lamp with shaking hands. Your lawyers don't exist. But he doesn't know that. She laughed, short and sharp. You lie well. Years of practice in business. What happens when he finds out? We'll be ready. She set the rifle aside and came to him, pressing her face against his chest. He held her, feeling her tremble, not with fear, he realized, but with rage. I'm tired of running, she said. Tired of being afraid. If they want a war, let them come. He tilted her chin up. You don't have to fight alone anymore. I know. She pulled him down for a kiss that tasted of desperation and defiance. That's what scares me most. They stood there in the lamplight, holding each other while the wind tested the walls they'd reinforced. Finally, she stepped back. There's something else, she said. Something I need to tell you about Sam's death. She went to her room, returning with a small leather journal. This was Sam's. I found it hidden after he died. Look at the last entry. Matthew read by lamplight. Sam's scrawled handwriting detailed the silver deposits, potential yields. And then, Morrison says Thornton will pay $500 for the claim. Told him I wanted $1,000 and the woman off my hands. He said he'd consider it, meeting him tonight to finalize. He was going to sell you? Like livestock. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned. I showed this to the sheriff. He said it proved nothing except business talk. But Morrison killed him instead of paying. Cheaper that way, and they figured they could scare me off after. She took the journal back. I thought about burning this, evidence of how little I was worth to my own husband, but now it's proof of conspiracy. She nodded. If we can find someone to listen. That night, they prepared for siege in earnest. Matthew showed her how to load his repeating rifle, while she taught him to set snares that would alert them to approach. They worked in comfortable synchronization, two people learning to move as one. When exhaustion finally drove them to rest, Eliza hesitated at her door. Stay with me? It wasn't an invitation to passion, not yet, just a need not to face the darkness alone. They lay fully clothed on her narrow bed, Matthew's arms around her, her back pressed to his chest. He could feel her breathing gradually slow, feel the tension leave her body as sleep took hold. Matthew? She whispered just before she drifted off. If something happens to me, nothing will happen to you. But if it does, promise you won't let them win. Promise you'll fight for this place. He pressed his lips to her hair. I promise. She relaxed then, trusting his word. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, a wild, lonely sound that seemed to mock human plans. But inside, for these few hours at least, two damaged souls had found shelter in each other. The week Thornton had given them was ticking away. Soon, violence would come to their door. But tonight, Matthew held Eliza while she slept, and felt something he'd thought dead forever stirring in his chest. Not just desire, though that was there, banked like a carefully tended fire. This was something more dangerous. Hope. He'd come to this desolate place to hide from life. Instead, he'd found someone worth fighting for, worth living for. The irony wasn't lost on him. In seeking emptiness, he'd found himself filling up again, like a dry well slowly fed by an underground spring. Eliza shifted in her sleep, murmuring something he couldn't catch. Her hair smelled of the lavender soap he'd bought in town. A small civilization in this wild place. He tightened his arms around her. A promise made flesh. Let Thornton come. Let the whole town come. They'd learn what two people with nothing left to lose could do when they finally found something worth keeping. Dawn broke gray and bitter on the day Matthew found the blood-smeared rock through their front window. Glass scattered across the floor, and wrapped around the projectile was another note. The witch dies today. Eliza stood in her nightdress, staring at the message with an expression of weary resignation. They're getting bolder, or more desperate. Matthew swept up the glass, noting how his hands no longer shook at such provocations. 2 weeks of constant threat had steadied his nerves in ways years of business battles never had. Thornton's deadline passed 3 days ago, and yet we're still here. My supposed lawyers must worry him more than he lets on. She moved to the stove, beginning the morning ritual of coffee and breakfast as if rocks through windows were ordinary inconveniences. But Matthew saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept the rifle within reach. They'd turned the homestead into a small fortress, water barrels filled, ammunition sorted, clear fields of fire established from every window. But fortifications meant nothing if the entire town turned against them. We need to go back, Eliza said suddenly. To town. That's what they want, to catch us in the open. No. She turned to face him. They want us to hide here until they work up enough courage or anger to burn us out. But if we go to town, act normal. Show we're not afraid. It could force their hand, or make them hesitate. She lifted her chin in that way he'd come to recognize as pure stubbornness. I'm tired of letting them dictate terms. An hour later, they rode toward Redemption Creek. Matthew had insisted on the wagon instead of horseback, harder to ambush, and it let them bring supplies that suggested routine business rather than flight. Eliza wore her best dress again, this time with his gift of a new shawl around her shoulders. She'd protested the expense, but he'd seen how she touched the soft wool, how she sat a little straighter wearing it. The town was busy for a Saturday morning. Farmers bringing goods to market, ranch hands spending their pay, the usual ebb and flow of frontier commerce. But conversation died as their wagon rolled down Main Street. Steady, Matthew murmured as hostile faces turned their way. They stopped at the general store. Matthew helped Eliza down, keeping his hand at her elbow as they climbed the steps. The proprietor, a thin man named Henderson, looked like he'd swallowed lye when they entered. We don't want trouble, Henderson said immediately. Neither do we, Matthew replied pleasantly. Just need supplies. I have a list. He handed over the paper, watching Henderson's face change as he read. It was a clever list. Items suggesting long-term residence, including seeds for spring planting and lumber for expansion. Let the town chew on that, while Henderson reluctantly filled their order. Eliza moved through the store with calculated dignity. She examined fabrics, tested the weight of skillets, acted like any rancher's wife provisioning her household. Only Matthew saw how white her knuckles were where she gripped her reticule. Brave of you to show your face here. They turned to find Mrs. Thornton in the doorway, a severe woman who wore respectability like armor. Behind her stood two other town matrons, their faces pinched with righteous anger. I have as much right to shop as anyone, Eliza said quietly. Rights? Mrs. Thornton's laugh was like breaking glass. You forfeited those when you killed your husband. I didn't kill Sam. Then who did? The ghost that haunts your cursed land? She stepped closer, and Matthew moved to intervene. But Eliza caught his arm. Perhaps you should ask your husband, Eliza said, or Jake Morrison. They seem very interested in our property. Color drained from Mrs. Thornton's face. How dare you? I dare because I have nothing left to lose. Can you say the same? The woman's hand rose as if to slap Eliza, but Matthew stepped between them. Touch her, and I'll have you arrested for assault. By whom? My husband owns the law here. Then I'll handle it myself. He let his coat fall open, revealing the colt at his hip. I may be an Easterner, ma'am, but I learned to shoot from men who fought at Shiloh. Don't test me. Mrs. Thornton retreated, but her parting words carried venom. You'll burn with her. Langford, the whole town's talking about it. The witch has you under her spell. After she left, Henderson finished their order in strained silence. As they loaded the wagon, Matthew noticed men gathering in small groups, watching them with predatory interest. We should go, he said. But Eliza was looking across the street at the small church. Wait, there's someone I need to see. The cemetery behind the church was poorly tended, wooden crosses tilting at drunken angles. Eliza led him to a newer grave, marked with a simple stone, Samuel Ward, 1,855 to 1,882 inches. I haven't been here since the burial, she said. Seemed hypocritical to mourn him. And now I just feel empty. He's dead. I'm alive, and none of it matters to anyone but us. She knelt, brushing dirt from the stone. I used to imagine confronting him, making him admit what he'd done, making him sorry. But the dead don't apologize. A shadow fell across them. They looked up to find Reverend Davies, an elderly man with gentle eyes that held more steel than his soft voice suggested. Mrs. Ward, Mr. Langford. He nodded to each. Dangerous times to be visiting graves. Are you warning us off, Reverend? Matthew asked. Quite the opposite. Davies glanced around, then lowered his voice. There are those in town who don't hold with mob justice. Not many, but some. If you need sanctuary, a church won't stop Thornton. No, but conscience might stop some of his followers. He pressed a folded paper into Eliza's hand. Names of those who might stand with you, if pushed. We're not all cowards here. Before they could respond, shouts erupted from Main Street. They hurried to the front of the church to see smoke rising from the direction of the general store. Fire! Someone yelled, and the town erupted into motion. But Matthew noticed something odd. Men running toward the fire weren't carrying buckets. They were carrying guns. It's a distraction, he said, pulling Eliza toward their wagon. There, the first shot shattered the church window above their heads. The wagon! Eliza shouted, but mounted men were already surrounding it, cutting off their escape. Matthew counted 8 riders, all armed, all wearing masks. Not Thornton's usual men. These were hired guns. Professionals. Inside the church, Davies commanded, throwing open the doors. Quickly, they dove through as more shots splintered the door frame. Inside, Matthew overturned pews to create barricades while Eliza took position at a window with her rifle. This is holy ground, Davies shouted at the attackers. You dare not! A bullet punched through the door inches from his head. So much for sanctuary, Matthew muttered, checking his ammunition. He had maybe 20 rounds. Eliza had less. They won't burn a church, Eliza said, sighting down her rifle. Too many believers in town, even among Thornton's men. They don't need to burn it, just wait us out. But even as he spoke, the shooting stopped. In the sudden silence, they heard horses departing, men shouting in the distance. Matthew risked a look outside. The masked riders were gone, but walking down the center of Main Street came Sheriff Watson, backed by a dozen armed townsmen. No masks now. This was meant to be legal. Langford, Mrs. Ward, come out. You're under arrest. On what charges? Matthew called. Inciting violence, disturbing the peace, resisting lawful authority. Watson's voice carried the smugness of a man who knew the game was rigged. Come quiet, and you'll get a trial. Make us come in after you. They'll kill us the moment we step outside, Eliza said flatly. She was right, but staying meant involving Davies further, and the old reverend had already risked enough. Matthew made a decision. I'll go out, create a distraction. You slip out the back. No, Eliza's voice was iron. Together or not at all, remember? Eliza, she kissed him, fierce and quick. I love you, Matthew Langford. In case I don't get another chance to say it. His throat closed. I love you too. Then let's give them a show they won't forget. They walked out together, hands raised but heads high. The crowd had grown. Half the town seemed to have gathered. Faces hungry for drama. Matthew spotted Mrs. Thornton in the crowd, her satisfied smile faltering when she saw their joined hands. Separate them, Watson ordered. No. Matthew's voice carried across the square. You want us, you take us together. Or does Thornton fear what we might say at trial? Watson hesitated. The crowd murmured. This wasn't following the expected script. Then Myra pushed through the crowd, and Matthew's heart sank. The girl who'd warned them was sobbing, her face bruised. They made me, she cried. They said they'd hurt my family if I didn't lie. Shut up, Watson backhanded her, sending her sprawling. The crowd's murmur turned uglier. Hitting a woman informant, even a forced one, didn't sit well with Western sensibilities. Is this your law? Eliza called out, helping Myra to her feet. Beating women, forcing false testimony. What happened to Sam wasn't enough. Now you need more blood? You killed your husband, someone shouted. No. A new voice spoke from the crowd. Jake Morrison stepped forward, whiskey-bowled and sweating. No, she didn't. The square went silent. Morrison looked at Thornton, who stood frozen by his office door. I'm done lying, done being afraid. He turned to the crowd. I killed Sam Ward, on Thornton's orders, because Sam found silver and wouldn't sell cheap. The explosion of voices was deafening. Watson reached for his gun, but Morrison was faster, drunk but still deadly. The two men faced each other across 20 feet of dusty street. "Don't," Matthew said quietly, but Morrison's face held the peace of a man who'd made his last choice. "I'm sorry," Morrison said, looking directly at Eliza. "For all of it." Watson drew, Morrison drew. 2 shots cracked simultaneously. Watson clutched his shoulder. Gun falling. Morrison stood swaying for a moment, a red stain spreading across his chest. Then he fell. In the chaos that followed, men running, women screaming, someone finally organizing a real bucket brigade for the still-burning store, Matthew and Eliza slipped away. Davies appeared with their wagon, having spirited it behind the church. "Go," he urged. "This isn't over, but you've got a chance now. Morrison's confession changes everything." They drove hard for home, not speaking until the buildings faded behind them. Then Eliza began to sob. Great, wrenching sounds that seemed torn from her chest. Matthew stopped the wagon, gathering her against him. "It's over," he confessed. "Everyone heard." "It's not that." She pulled back, eyes streaming. "Don't you see? I wished him dead. Sam, I prayed for it. And now Morrison too. Everyone I touch—" "Stop." He gripped her shoulders. "Morrison chose his path. Sam chose his. You survived theirs. That's not a curse. That's strength." She searched his face. "What if I get you killed too?" "Then I'll die living more fully than I ever did in Denver." He wiped her tears with his thumbs. "But I don't plan on dying. I plan on marrying you, if you'll have me, making this place what it should be, together. The town will never accept. To hell with the town. We'll build something new, better." He kissed her softly. "Say yes, Eliza. Choose hope for once." She was quiet for a long moment, then managed a watery smile. "Yes, God help me. Yes." They drove home through gathering dusk, the mountains purple against the sky. Behind them, Redemption Creek writhed with change. Old powers crumbling in the face of truth finally spoken. Ahead lay their homestead, battered but standing. Like them, it would take time to heal, to build, to find their place in whatever new order emerged. But for now, it was enough to be alive, to be together, to have wrested a future from the ashes of their pasts. The circuit judge arrived in Redemption Creek 3 weeks after Morrison's confession, bringing with him a federal marshal and the kind of authority that made even Thornton tread carefully. Judge Solomon Pierce was a tall, austere man who'd ridden the Colorado circuit for 15 years, known for both his fairness and his intolerance of frontier justice. Matthew and Eliza sat in the packed courtroom, her hand tight in his. The whole town had turned out, cramming into the small building that usually served as a meeting hall. The smell of too many bodies and tobacco smoke hung thick in the air. "This is not a trial for Samuel Ward's murder," Judge Pierce announced, his voice cutting through the whispers. "Jake Morrison confessed to that crime before dying, and the dead cannot be tried. However, we are here to address the matters of conspiracy, intimidation, and false accusation that have plagued this community." Thornton sat at the defendant's table, his beaver hat on the bench beside him, looking smaller without his usual coterie of armed men. The federal marshal had made it clear that any attempt at violence would be met with federal intervention, a threat that carried real weight. "Mrs. Ward." The judge addressed Eliza directly. "Please take the stand." Matthew squeezed her hand before she rose. She walked to the witness chair with the same dignity she'd shown facing down armed men, though he could see the slight tremor in her hands. "Tell us about your husband's death and the aftermath." Judge Pierce instructed. Eliza's testimony was clear, unflinching. She spoke of Sam's abuse, his plans to sell both land and wife, Morrison's drunken visits. She described the night Sam died, the accusations that followed, the months of isolation and threat. "Did you ever seek legal recourse?" the judge asked. "I tried. Sheriff Watson refused to investigate, said a woman's word meant nothing against upstanding citizens. Watson, stripped of his badge pending investigation, shifted uncomfortably in the gallery. And when Mr. Langford arrived, here, Eliza's voice softened slightly. He offered me dignity, partnership instead of pity. Together, we tried to build something worth keeping. The judge nodded. Mr. Thornton, your response. Thornton's lawyer, imported from Denver at considerable expense, rose smoothly. Your Honor, my client is a legitimate businessman who perhaps showed excessive zeal in pursuing a valuable property. There's no evidence linking him directly to any violence. I have evidence. The courtroom turned as Myra stood in the gallery, holding a leather-bound ledger. What's the nature of this evidence? Judge Pierce asked. Mr. Thornton's private accounts. Your Honor, I took them from his office. She flushed, but continued. They show payments to Morrison, to hired guns, even bribes to Sheriff Watson. All dated, all in his own hand. Thornton lurched to his feet. That's theft. You can't. Sit down. Mr. Thornton, the judge commanded. Young lady, bring that ledger forward. The next hour was damning. The ledger detailed years of corruption, land grabbed through intimidation. Claims jumped. At least 3 other suspicious deaths besides Sam Ward's. By the end, even Thornton's expensive lawyer looked defeated. This court finds sufficient evidence of conspiracy and corruption. Judge Pierce announced, Mr. Thornton, you are remanded to federal custody pending trial in Denver. Sheriff Watson, you are likewise charged with corruption of office. This court further finds that all claims against Mrs. Eliza Ward regarding her husband's death are baseless and malicious. She is free of any suspicion. The gavel came down like thunder. In the chaos that followed, Thornton being led away in irons, townspeople buzzing with shock and gossip, Matthew found Eliza on the courthouse steps, staring at the mountains. It's over, he said softly. Is it? She turned to him. The town still hates me. They may fear the law now, but fear isn't acceptance. Then we make our own acceptance, our own place. She studied his face. You really mean to stay, even now, knowing everything? Especially now. He took her hands. Marry me, Eliza. Not someday, now. Today, before anything else can interfere. Her eyes widened. Matthew, Judge Pierce can perform the ceremony. Reverend Davies will witness. We've waited long enough for life to begin again. She was quiet for a long moment, then smiled. The first truly unguarded smile he'd seen from her. Yes, let's stop waiting. An hour later, they stood in the small church, afternoon light slanting through windows still scarred by bullet holes. Judge Pierce officiated with surprising gentleness, while Reverend Davies and Myra served as witnesses. Half the town gathered outside, drawn by curiosity and scandal. Do you, Matthew Langford, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. The words came out fierce, protective, a vow and a challenge to anyone who might threaten what they'd built. Do you, Eliza Ward, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do. Softer, but no less certain. Then, by the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you man and wife. Matthew kissed his bride while whispers rippled through the watching crowd. Some hostile, some merely surprised, but a few, more than expected, approving. They spent their wedding night at the Homestead, the house feeling different now that it was truly theirs. Eliza had worried about the memories haunting the place, but as Matthew held her in the bed they'd reinforced together, she felt only peace. No ghosts, he asked, reading her thoughts as he'd learned to do. No ghosts, she confirmed. Just us. They came together with a passion born of survived danger and chosen trust. All the careful walls they'd maintained crumbled in the darkness, leaving only truth between them, scarred but healing, careful but hoping. Afterward, they lay entwined while spring wind rattled the windows. What now? Eliza asked. Now we build, plant those seeds we bought, fix the barn properly, maybe buy some cattle. He pressed a kiss to her hair. Make this place what it should have been. The silver can stay in the ground for now. We have enough money from my Denver accounts to establish ourselves. When we're ready, when the town has adjusted to the new order, we'll file proper claims. Do it right." She shifted to look at him. "You've thought this through. I've had time. All those nights standing guard. I planned our future." He traced her face in the darkness. "Children, eventually. A bigger house. Maybe even respectability. Though I care less about that than I used to. Children," she repeated softly. "I never dared hope. Hope now. We've earned it." A week later, the transformation began in earnest. Matthew hired men from neighboring towns, those without prejudice against Eliza, to help rebuild the barn. She started a kitchen garden, coaxing life from soil that had known too much neglect. Together, they repaired fences, cleared irrigation ditches, made plans for the future. The town's reaction was mixed. Some, shamed by how wrong they'd been, made overtures of friendship. Mrs. Henderson from the general store brought a wedding cake, late but sincere. Others, particularly those who'd been close to Thornton, maintained their hostility, but it was toothless now without the backing of corrupt law. Mrs. Langford. Eliza still started at the name when townspeople used it, but she was learning to wear it like armor. "My husband and I would like to order supplies." It was market day, their third trip to town as a married couple. This time, no one spat as they passed. Progress, Matthew thought. They were loading their wagon when a familiar figure approached. The land company representative who'd first sold Matthew the property. "Mr. Langford, Mrs. Langford." He tipped his hat nervously. "I wonder if we might discuss business." "If you're here to make another offer," Matthew began. No, rather the opposite." The man pulled out a document. "The Colorado Land Development Company is dissolving, given recent unpleasantness. We're prepared to sell you the adjacent sections at a very reasonable price. All legal, all proper. A wedding gift, you might say." Eliza looked at Matthew. They discussed expansion, but not this soon. "How reasonable?" Matthew asked. The number the man named was almost insultingly low. Clearly, the company wanted to divest quickly and quietly. "We'll think about it," Matthew said. But he already knew they'd accept. More land meant more security, more future. As they drove home, Eliza was quiet. Then she said, "They're afraid of us now." "Some are. I don't want to be feared. I've been the town pariah. I don't want to become the town tyrant." Matthew considered this. "Then we'll have to earn something better than fear. Respect takes time. But we have that now." Together, they crested the rise that overlooked their homestead, their land, their future. The sun was setting, turning the grassland gold and the mountains purple. Smoke rose from their chimney, straight and true in the still air. "Look," Eliza said suddenly. At first, Matthew saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed what had caught her eye. Green shoots pushing through the dead grass near the house. Spring growth, finally breaking through after the long, hard winter. "It's like Davies said in the ceremony," Eliza murmured. "Beauty from ashes." Matthew pulled her close on the wagon seat. "No more ashes, only beauty from here on." She laughed, the sound carrying across their land like a blessing. "That's optimistic, even for you." "Then we'll take whatever comes, but we'll take it. Together," she finished. "Yes, always together." As they descended toward home, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Behind them, Redemption Creek settled into its new reality, one where justice had finally been served, where old powers had fallen and new possibilities stirred. But Matthew and Eliza looked only forward, toward the house they'd defended, the land they'd claimed, the life they'd chosen against all odds. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, fences to mend, crops to plant, relationships to build or rebuild. Tonight, though, they were simply Matthew and Eliza Langford, riding home through the spring dusk, no longer haunted by the past, but finally, tentatively, hopefully, facing the future as one. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late summer, when the wheat they'd planted stood golden and ready for harvest. Matthew found it waiting at the postal station during their weekly trip to town, his name written in careful script he didn't recognize. "What is it?" Eliza asked, noting his frown as he read. He handed her the letter. "It's from a law firm in Denver. Apparently, I have a visitor who insists on seeing me. Someone from my past." The name in the letter made Eliza's breath catch. Mrs. Catherine Harcourt, Margaret's sister, Matthew's sister-in-law, who had blamed him publicly for her sister's death. "When?" "She's already there, staying at the Mountain View Hotel." He crumpled the letter. "I don't have to see her." "Yes, you do." Eliza straightened his collar with gentle hands. "You can't run from ghosts any more than I could." They found Catherine in the hotel's modest parlor, a severe woman in expensive mourning clothes that seemed out of place in the frontier setting. Her face, so like Margaret's it made Matthew's chest tight, was carved with lines of grief and bitterness. "Matthew?" She didn't rise, didn't offer her hand. "You look weathered." "Catherine." He guided Eliza forward. "May I present my wife, Eliza?" Catherine's eyes swept over Eliza, taking in the simple dress, the calloused hands, the quiet strength. "So, it's true, you've married a—" She paused, seeming to reconsider her words. "A local woman." "Why are you here?" Matthew asked, refusing to let her bait them. "To see what became of you, to understand how a man who let his wife and child die could simply start over." Her voice cracked on the last words. Eliza stepped forward before Matthew could respond. "Would you like some tea, Mrs. Harcourt? You've come a long way." Catherine blinked, clearly not expecting kindness. Yes, thank you." Over tea, the story emerged in pieces. Catherine had never married, dedicating herself to charitable work in Margaret's memory. But the anger had eaten at her, the need to confront Matthew growing until she couldn't resist. "She spoke of you in her letters," Catherine said, staring into her cup. "How lonely she was, how you were always gone, always chasing another deal. She said the house felt like a tomb." Matthew flinched. Eliza's hand found his under the table. "I wasn't a good husband," he said quietly. "I know that. I've lived with that knowledge every day since. Yet you seem to have recovered admirably." Catherine's gaze swept between them. "A new wife, a new life, as if they never existed." "That's not true," Eliza said firmly. "Matthew came here because the grief was killing him. He bought a broken-down homestead in the middle of nowhere to hide from life. Does that sound like a man who'd forgotten?" Catherine studied her more carefully. "You defend him passionately." "I love him, not despite his past, but including it. The man who grieved so deeply that he exiled himself. That's the man I married." "Tell me about them," Matthew said suddenly. "Margaret, Sarah. Tell me how you remember them." Catherine's composure finally cracked. Tears flowed as she spoke of her sister, not the distant wife Matthew remembered, but the girl who'd loved music, who'd pressed flowers in books, who'd dreamed of traveling west ironically enough. "She would have liked it here," Catherine whispered. "The mountains, the space. She felt so confined in Philadelphia." "I never knew that," Matthew admitted. "She never said. You never asked." The words hung heavy between them. Then Eliza spoke. "I lost my first husband, too. Not to illness, but to violence. For months afterward. I wished I'd died instead. The guilt of surviving, of feeling relief mixed with grief. It nearly destroyed me." She looked directly at Catherine. "But the dead don't want us to die with them. They want us to live, to find whatever happiness we can salvage." Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then, Show me this life you've built." They brought her to the homestead as the sun began its descent. Catherine stood in the dooryard, taking in the repaired buildings, the thriving garden, the wheat fields ready for harvest. "It's not what I expected," she admitted. Over dinner, simple fare but well prepared, she began to thaw. Eliza drew her out with gentle questions. And soon Catherine was sharing stories of her work with orphanages, her frustrations with Philadelphia society, her own loneliness. "I've been so angry," she confessed as they sat by the fire after the meal. "It seemed easier than sadness. Anger is armor," Eliza said, "but it's heavy to carry." That night, they gave Catherine their bed while they slept in the barn's new loft, lying in the hay, listening to owls call across the darkness. Matthew whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" "For being gracious when you had every right not to be, for defending me when I couldn't defend myself. That's what partners do." She curled against him. "Besides, she needed to forgive you, almost as much as you needed to hear it." The next morning brought an unexpected crisis. One of their hired hands rode in hard, shouting about fire, not their land, the Olsen place to the south, where a Swedish family had recently settled. "Lightning strike," the hand reported. "Barn's gone. House is threatened. They need help." Without hesitation, Matthew began organizing. Within an hour, they had a wagon loaded with supplies and all available hands. Catherine, still in her Philadelphia finery, stood watching. "You're going to fight someone else's fire." "That's what neighbors do," Eliza said, tying her hair back. "Will you be all right here alone?" Catherine surprised them both. "I'm coming with you." They found the Olsen homestead in chaos. The barn was indeed gone, reduced to smoking timbers, and fire had spread to the surrounding grass. The family, parents and 3 young children, stood helplessly as their dreams burned. Matthew immediately took charge, organizing bucket brigades and fire breaks. Eliza comforted the distraught mother while helping salvage what they could from the threatened house. And Catherine, her expensive dress soon ruined, worked alongside ranch hands to beat back the flames with wet blankets. It took hours, but they saved the house and most of the outbuildings. As the sun set, the exhausted group collapsed around the Olsens' well, passing water buckets and sharing what food had been brought. "We're ruined, mister," Olsen said, his Swedish accent thick with despair. "No barn, no hay stored for winter." "You're not ruined," Matthew said firmly. "We'll help you rebuild, share our hay until you can cut more. That's how it works out here. But we cannot pay. Today you can't. Someday you will, when someone else needs help." He looked around the group, his hired hands, Eliza, even Catherine with soot on her face and her hair falling loose. That's what community means. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Olsen caught Eliza's hands. "We heard stories in town about you. They said—" She shook her head. "They were wrong. You are an angel, riding home under stars." Catherine was silent until they neared the homestead. Then, Margaret would have done that. Helped. She always wanted to be useful. But society taught us to be ornamental. "It's never too late to change," Eliza offered. Catherine looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. "No, I suppose it isn't." She stayed 3 more days, each one peeling back another layer of armor. She helped Eliza with the garden, learning to distinguish weeds from vegetables. She watched Matthew work with his men, seeing him not as the absent husband she'd hated, but as a man who'd learned the value of presence. She even attempted to milk the cow, laughing when she failed spectacularly. On her last morning, she found them having breakfast together, Matthew reading crop reports while Eliza mended a harness, their free hands linked across the table in unconscious connection. "I came here to hate you," she told Matthew, "to prove you were living carelessly on the graves of my sister and niece. And now I see you're living carefully, deliberately, with the knowledge of loss making each day precious." She turned to Eliza. "Take care of him. We take care of each other," Eliza corrected gently. At the stage station, Catherine embraced them both, another surprise. "I'll write," she promised. "And perhaps you might visit Philadelphia someday. I think some of those orphans would benefit from hearing about different kinds of lives." As the stage pulled away, Matthew felt something shift inside his chest. A loosening of bonds he hadn't realized still held him. "She forgave you," Eliza said. More importantly, I think she forgave herself for not being able to save them, for surviving when they didn't. They stood together as dust from the stage settled, then turned toward home. The wheat was ready for harvest. The Olsons needed help with their barn raising, and life moved forward as it always did on the frontier, one day, one task, one act of grace at a time. That evening, as they worked side by side preparing supper, Eliza said, "She was wrong about one thing." "What's that?" "You're not living on their graves. You're living in spite of them. There's a difference." Matthew pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, lavender soap and sunshine and home. "The difference is you." "No," she corrected, tilting her face up to his. "The difference is us." Outside, twilight painted the mountains purple and the wheat fields gold. Their land stretched around them, no longer a place of exile, but of possibility. Tomorrow would bring the harvest, neighbors to help, work that mattered. But tonight, they stood in their kitchen, holding each other while the day's last light blessed what they'd built from ashes. Catherine's visit had closed one chapter definitely, but as Eliza reached up to kiss him, Matthew knew the story they were writing together had only just begun. The letter Eliza would receive from Catherine months later would be addressed to "My dear sister." But that was still to come. For now, there was only this, the two of them, the land they'd claimed, and the life they'd chosen. No longer haunted but whole. The first snow of winter came early that year, dusting the mountains like sugar while the valleys still wore autumn gold. Eliza stood at the window, one hand pressed to her lower back, watching Matthew and their hired hands bring in the last of the harvest. Her other hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, where new life had taken root during the summer months. She hadn't told him yet. Part of her still feared the jinx of speaking hope aloud, remembering too well the women she'd known who'd lost babies to the harsh realities of frontier life. But today, with the barn full and their root cellar stocked, with the neighbors who now greeted them warmly in town, she felt brave enough to believe in the future. "You shouldn't be on your feet so long," Matthew said, coming in with an armload of firewood. Frost clung to his beard. He'd let it grow as winter approached, and she found she'd liked the way it made him look both wilder and somehow more at home. "I'm fine." She turned from the window. "Decision made. Actually, I'm better than fine. I have something to tell you." He set the wood down, immediately concerned. "Are you ill?" "No." She took his cold hands in hers, warming them. "The opposite. Matthew, we're going to have a baby." The emotions that crossed his face, shock, joy, fear, wonder, made her heart clench. He pulled her close, then immediately loosened his grip. "I won't break," she laughed, though tears pricked her eyes. "I'm not that fragile. A baby." He breathed against her hair. "When?" "Spring, the doctor thinks. April, maybe May." He pulled back to study her face. "How long have you known?" "A few weeks. I wanted to be sure." She touched his cheek. "Are you happy?" "Happy?" He laughed, the sound rough with emotion. "Eliza, I'm terrified and amazed and so grateful I can barely breathe. I'm scared too," she admitted. "But it's a good scared. A living scared, not a dying one." He understood. She could see it in his eyes. They'd both lived with a dying scared, the fear that came with loss and endings. This was different. This was the fear that came with beginnings. The news changed the rhythm of their days. Matthew became almost comically protective, trying to prevent her from lifting anything heavier than a tea kettle. Eliza bore it with amused patience, though she drew the line at being prevented from her normal chores entirely. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she told him firmly when he tried to stop her from helping with the barn work. Women have been having babies while running homesteads since the beginning of time. But she appreciated his care, especially on the harder days when morning sickness left her weak or when her back ached from the changes in her body. He'd rub her feet by the fire in the evenings, telling stories of the future he envisioned, their child learning to ride, helping with chores, maybe siblings following. Not too many siblings. Eliza laughed. Let's see how we manage one first. The community's response to their news was heartwarming. Women who'd once crossed the street to avoid Eliza now stopped her in town to offer advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. Mrs. Henderson from the general store ordered special items from Denver. Proper baby things, she said firmly, refusing payment. Even more surprising was the letter from Catherine that arrived in February. Along with congratulations, she'd sent a package of baby clothes and a silver rattle that had belonged to baby Sarah. I cleaned out Margaret's things finally, she wrote. These should be used, not hidden away. May your child bring you the joy mine brought, however briefly. Matthew wept when he read that, and Eliza held him, understanding that grief and joy could exist in the same space without diminishing either. As winter deepened and Eliza's condition advanced, they received unexpected visitors. The Olsons arrived one Sunday with lumber loaded in their wagon. For the baby's room, Mr. Olson explained, you helped us rebuild. Now we help you build. Soon it became a community event. The Millers brought windows they'd ordered but decided were too small for their own house. The Washburns contributed paint. Even families who'd been cool toward them before offered supplies or labor. Why? Eliza asked Mrs. Davies, the Reverend's wife, as they watched the men frame out an addition to the house. People need chances to make amends, the older woman said simply. You and Matthew gave them that chance by staying, by being good neighbors despite everything. This is their way of saying they were wrong. As spring approached and Eliza grew heavy with child, Matthew's protective instincts intensified. He'd wake at night to check on her, bring her tea before she asked, hover anxiously whenever she showed any discomfort. I can't lose you, he admitted one night when she teased him about his fussing. Not you, not our child. I couldn't survive it again. You won't lose us, she promised, though she knew no one could truly make such promises. We're too stubborn to leave you. The pain started on an April morning when the wildflowers were just beginning to bloom. Matthew rode hard for town to fetch Dr. Hartwell while Eliza, attended by Mrs. Davies and Mrs. Olson, labored through the day. It was a long birth and difficult. More than once, Eliza saw fear shadow Matthew's face as he held her hand. Memories of other losses clearly haunting him. But she was strong, stronger than the pain, stronger than the fear. As sunset painted the mountains red, their son entered the world with a cry that seemed to shake the rafters. A boy. Doctor, Hartwell announced, placing the baby in Eliza's exhausted arms. Healthy and loud. He'll make a fine rancher someday. Matthew touched his son's face with trembling fingers. He's perfect. What shall we call him? Eliza asked, though they'd discussed names for months. Thomas, Matthew said firmly. Thomas Samuel Langford. Eliza's eyes widened. Samuel, after a man who, for all his faults, brought us together. Without him, there's no us, no this. He kissed her forehead. It's a common enough name. He can make it mean what he chooses. As she nursed their son for the first time, Eliza felt a peace she'd never known. Not the peace of endings, but of continuings. Outside, she could hear their neighbors still celebrating, someone playing a fiddle, laughter carrying on the spring wind. We did it, she whispered. You did it, Matthew corrected. I just worried. We did it, she insisted. All of it, the land, the house, the life, together. A year later, on Thomas's first birthday, they held a party that brought half the county to their homestead. Tables groaned under the weight of food. Children ran between the buildings, and music filled the air. The silver mine was producing now, making them wealthy beyond their original dreams. But they still lived simply, pouring resources back into the community that had finally embraced them. Hard to believe, Reverend Davies said, bouncing Thomas on his knee, that 2 years ago this place was cursed ground, and you two were the town pariahs. Maybe it was cursed, Eliza said, watching Matthew teach the Olson boys how to rope. But curses can be broken. With love, the Reverend suggested. With stubbornness. She laughed. Love helps, though. As the sun set, painting everything golden, Matthew found her sitting on the porch, Thomas sleeping in her arms. "Regrets?" he asked, settling beside her. "Never." She leaned into him. "You? Only that it took so long to find you." "We found each other when we were ready. When we'd been broken enough to know how to heal." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I used to dream about ashes, about everything I touched turning to dust. And now I dream about mornings, about Thomas laughing, about the wheat growing tall, about you." He smiled. "Turns out I was never good at predicting the future." "Thank God for that," she said. They sat together as stars emerged above the mountains, their sun safe between them, their land stretching out productive and peaceful in all directions. The ghosts were quiet now, laid to rest not by forgetting, but by living fully in spite of loss. In the house they'd rebuilt together, in the community they'd helped heal, in the child they'd created from love and hope and sheer determination. They'd written a different ending than the one fate had first offered. Not ashes, after all, but fire, warm and bright and endlessly renewed. As the last of their guests departed and they prepared for bed, Eliza looked back at the day, at neighbors become friends, at a home become sanctuary, at a curse become blessing. "What is it?" Matthew asked, seeing her smile. "Just thinking, we're not the same people who met in this house 2 years ago?" "No," he agreed, shifting Thomas to his shoulder. "We're better. We're whole," she corrected. And in the lamp-lit evening of their hard-won happiness, it was simply, blessedly true. Thank you all for joining us around the campfire tonight and listening to Matthew and Eliza's story. I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop a comment and let us know which corner of the world you're tuning in from. If you enjoyed this tale of love and redemption in the Old West, please subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories that bring the frontier to life. And don't forget to share your thoughts about Matthew and Eliza's journey. What touched your heart the most? Until next time, partners, keep the campfire burning and the stories flowing.